for being our superhero.
Only at Vanguard, you're more than just an investor. You're an owner, giving you flexibility to follow your dreams. That's the value of ownership.
A fossil fuel conundrum for Californians as an extreme heat wave strains their energy grid and raises concerns for a future with less oil and gas, as Governor Gavin Newsom pushes a plan to sell only electric vehicles by 2035. Meanwhile, Newsom used recent high temperatures as a call to action against climate change.
Even the worst of the worst case scenario never extended for a week like this. And it's putting stress and strain that's unprecedented in the state's history. This is not permanent. We are accelerating that transition. What you may not have seen was the additional $7.9 billion for clean energy projects. And that gives me much more confidence that we can meet the ambitious goals as we move to 2035.
Could the left's green agenda turn more voters red? Let's take this up with our panel. Joining me now is former Nassau County Executive Laura Curran and host of the Guy Benson Show and Fox News contributor Guy Benson. Thanks you both for joining us. Guy Benson, let me start with you. How on earth does California, a rich and prosperous state with plentiful resources, how does it find itself facing power outages and an energy crisis, it seems, every couple of years?
The government and regulation and environmentalism and an extreme ideology. That's sort of the short answer.
Extreme ideology.
And it's interesting just to see the juxtaposition in the span of about 1 week where California with great fanfare announces that they're going to start banning gas-fueled cars within the next, 10, 15 years. And then days later, they're forced to tell people who already have electric vehicles, don't charge them, because we can't afford to do that with the energy situation right now. And I joked, I was on the news channel a few days ago, I said sometimes we're paid to make points, but occasionally the points make themselves. And in this case, the point is making itself. And one other question I would ask, to broaden it out to the country, the Biden administration and the Energy Secretary has said very explicitly, Jennifer Granholm, a few times in recent months, that California is the way forward. They are the model for the country when it comes to the future of energy. Now we're seeing what's happening in that state, and I wonder how she would grapple with that. Does she wish to amend her comments or her predictions, perhaps?
Laura Curran, the United States was a few years ago energy self-sufficient. It does seem like the Democrats came in, decided to conduct their war on oil and gas and fossil fuels, and surprise, surprise, we now find ourselves facing soaring energy prices, shortages, crises, blackouts, like the kind that we're getting in California. See a connection between those two things?
You know, it's interesting because this whole thing that's happening in California shines a really stark light on the fact that you can't just flick a switch and go green. The infrastructure takes a long time. There really has to be a lot of transition, and I think, you know, regular people out there, they understand that green's important. They generally know that we got to get there at some point. But the people who are in charge right now have to make sure that they have really good operational people to make sure that we can make this transition. You know, California is shutting down natural gas plants, fine, but then when you have a crisis with fires, with drought, with this heat wave and energy demand spike, and then, you know, as Guy says, you have this strange thing where, oh, get electric vehicles, but don't charge them right now. You can't just be political about it, you've got to think operationally as
Laura,
well.
so isn't it these green policies, though, that is creating this problem, that we're not ready yet to move to an era of complete renewable energy, and so in the meantime, we should be doing more with the fuels that we do have available?
I can't say I disagree with you. You have to move, in my opinion, towards being carbon neutral, towards being green, but the transition takes time, it can take decades, and you have to be very intentional how you do it. Don't think about it politically, think about it operationally. And unfortunately, right now, government is so political and not operational enough.
That's true. A dispiriting report on the learning loss of children during the pandemic. That has sparked a new round of the political blame game. Is anything being done to help our children? We'll take that up next.
Kennedy.
A 5-point dip.
Free shipping on your first order.
Summer has ended and children around the US are back in school, but the effects of COVID have carried on into the academic new year. A study by the National Center for Education Statistics revealed a precipitous drop in math and reading test scores for 9-year-olds during the pandemic, a 5-point dip in reading and 7 points down in math. It's a loss of about 20 years of progress for that age group. Well, to no one's surprise, the Biden administration was quick to pass the blame.
We must repair the damage that was done by the last administration, the mismanagement that was done by the last administration.
I didn't shut down anything, didn't recommend shutting everything down. I was also one of the people that said we've got to do everything we can to get the children back in school.
So, Laura Curran, let me start with you. Democrats were the party that was telling us to lock down. You can just look across states and cities across the country. They stayed locked down. They shut schools. School unions, teachers' unions demanded that kids not be allowed back into school. Now Democrats seem to be telling us, no, it wasn't our fault that children have suffered so much.
You know, I can tell you, I have kids who are high school and college age. This is a really big deal. I hear it from their friends. I hear it from my friends. And right now, education, this was just actually reported in the Wall Street Journal, education is the top issue of 60% of registered voters. More than abortion, more than immigration, more than energy that we were just talking about. This affects our kids, and of course, when you think about it, play it forward. These kids are going to grow up. Are they going to be behind? Are they going to be delayed as they get up and start to be in charge of society? This is a really big concern, and honestly, I think this is something that you hear Democrats, and I say this as a Democrat, to blame other things or other people for it is irresponsible. We have to take responsibility, and we have to do it quickly.
Guy Benson, Democrats, are you buying this message from the Democrats that they were no, it wasn't their fault that schools shut down. It's all Donald Trump. It was the Trump administration's fault, according to the White House.
It's not just gaslighting, it's outright lies. I don't know how else to put it. President Trump, for any number of faults in his approach to the pandemic, was absolutely right in the summer of 2020 to say we have to reopen the schools in the fall, and he urged districts across the country to do so. And I think a lot of Democrats, frankly, in various states and communities and jurisdictions said, well, we're resistance warriors, and if Trump wants us to do something, we're going to do the opposite. If Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida is going to do something, he made the right call based on the data, we're going to do the opposite. And if kids fall behind and lose 20 years worth of progress and are affected by this for the rest of their lives, so be it, because there are politics to play here. And to now come back after all of this and pretend that it's somehow the Republicans' fault or the Democrats didn't do this is absolutely ludicrous. And if you listen to some of them now, including Senator Patty Murray, she did an interview last weekend on CNN. Her overall point on this was no regrets. They would do it again. And I think that's something that parents really need to grapple with. And people who care about the future of this country and America's children need to think about long and hard in November, because this is the first national election we're going to have since all of those failed policies were put into place, since all that harm was done. And I think accountability will only come at the ballot box based on the actions of the Democrats and now these fairy tales they're trying to peddle.
As you both say, it looks like it could be a big political factor. 21 years, however, after the tragedy of September 11th, will the United States ever again experience the kind of unity that we saw in the days and months that followed? We'll take that up next.
The 2022 midterms. As Election Day closes in, take a look at the candidates, the key issues, and what's at stake. Larry Elder breaks it all down on Mornings with Maria. Then, Britain's mourning period for Queen Elizabeth.
We'll cover the events as they unfold.
Monday on
Patriotism. But was this the last great unifying moment in the country? Have we lost that sense of patriotism and purpose? A recent poll showed that 43% of Americans actually believe the US is bound for civil war in the next decade. Let's talk about this now with our guest. Guy Benson, let me start with you. We all remember those days after 9/11 and the tragedy and the mourning, but also the incredible sense of unity. And one of the things that worries me right now is if something like that, God forbid, should ever happen again, I wonder if a country that is as divided as it is now could come together in the way that it did then. What do you think?
I wonder about that too, although I kind of want to bring this back to your opening segment and the death of the Queen this week. there were so many moments that were, I think, when you think back, and memories that are evocative of that day, a horrible day in the aftermath. One video that I have watched probably a few dozen times over the years was the clip of the Royal Band at Buckingham Palace playing the Star-Spangled Banner on the 12th of September, under the orders of the Queen, who bucked hundreds of years of tradition to signal in this very powerful way, without any words at all, just a song, the solidarity and the friendship between our two countries. And it always chokes me up when I watch that video, and I thought about it when she died this week. And that was this very special snapshot in time of this unity across an ocean between two people, two countries, in that special relationship. And my hope and my prayer is that we can also come to unify across an aisle here at home.
I agree, me too. I remember that vividly and found it extremely moving. Laura Curran, briefly, what's it going to take to heal this country's divisions?
You know, to piggyback on what Guy said, the Queen was not political, and she gave people an emotional connection to their country, and my cynical mind tells me we don't really have that now, and I'm concerned that with conspiracy theories and with such mistrust, one side will say something, if something terrible happens, we're together maybe for 5 minutes. One side will say something so outrageous, the other side will have to react, and then off we go to the races. And I honestly do worry about that.
That's it for this week. My thanks to Laura Curran and Guy Benson. I'll be back next week with more commentary and interviews here on the Wall Street Journal at Large. In the meantime, thanks for joining us.
Baron?
Northern part of the
India, Ireland, much of Africa, just to name a few of the countries. To quote an often used phrase throughout the 18th and 20th centuries, the sun never sets on the British Empire. It literally meant that it was daylight somewhere around the globe in a place that Britain controlled. But nightfall for the empire was on the horizon by the time Elizabeth became queen, and it was ushered in by the colonized, not by the colonizer. In 1947, a few months after Queen Elizabeth II's 21st birthday, but 5 years before she became the monarch, Britain would lose one of its most crucial imperial possessions, India, and the newly partitioned Pakistan. For more than a century, Britain had exploited local rulers, workers, and resources in India, flooding the British economy with cotton and cash. India not only paved the way for Britain's massive global rise, but funded the continued progress of the Industrial Revolution. Remnants of colonialism in India continue in the conflict between India and Pakistan, and India's continued colonization of Kashmir. And I don't need to make a metaphor here. The 105-carat Kohinoor diamond, which sits in one of the 3 royal consort crowns, is a spoil of war from India. As countless sought and achieved independence from England, many became members of the British Commonwealth, which was formed in 1949. Upon her death, Queen Elizabeth II remained the head of state of 15 Commonwealth nations who chose her as their head of state. 36 of those countries are now republics without a royal head of state. 5 have their own monarchs. While the Commonwealth is a clear vestige of colonialism, initially conceived as a consortium of white settler colonies like South Africa at the time, the Commonwealth was a vehicle to preserve Britain's global influence at a time when decolonization was getting more popular around the world. But really, it positioned Britain at the head of a massive school, teaching the former colonists how to behave and how to, in theory, self-govern. Through the lens of history, it's now often seen as patronizing, sometimes racist, including during the 12 years that apartheid South Africa was a member. And it's generally a superfluous thing and probably a waste of money. By the mid-1970s, the British Empire was reduced to little pockets around the world. When Hong Kong was transferred to China in 1997, the then Prince of Wales called it, quote, the end of empire. That prince is now King Charles III. Colonization, British or otherwise, was economic exploitation, violence, and racism. Decolonization, virtually never initiated by the British, was often a bloody and deadly fight for independence. Example after example. The U.S. Revolutionary War, the concentration camps established during the Boer Wars in South Africa, the massacre of hundreds of Sikh worshippers in Amritsar, India, in under 10 minutes, by the way, in 1919. The death of between 20,000 and 100,000 people in the Mau Mau uprising in my birthplace of Kenya in the 1950s, the Opium Wars with China, and lesser-known atrocities like civilian torture in Cyprus, the continued mess that is Israel and Palestine today. All of it is the legacy of British colonialism. Queen Elizabeth was widely respected and admired. But if you're having mixed feelings about the mourning of the Queen and the institution she represented for so many decades, that's valid, and you're not alone.
Trilogy for COPD.
Birds flying high, you know how I feel.
Lesser-known atrocities like civilian torture in Cyprus, the continued mess that is Israel and Palestine today, all of it is the legacy of British colonialism. Queen Elizabeth was widely respected and admired. But if you're having mixed feelings about the mourning of the Queen and the institution she represented for so many decades, that's valid, and you're not alone.
Trilogy for COPD.
Birds flying high, you know how I feel.
It's really remarkably sad that people today cannot understand or accept or interpret the differences between the two worlds, between the world, the communication world that we have today versus the non-communication world that they had even going back 100, 200 years ago, much less all the other continents and countries that was basically in the dark whenever it come to communications. I think where a great deal of us don't comprehend the struggles, we don't comprehend the initial sacrifices that was made during the time that they was made. We don't comprehend the confusion because it was made, why it was made, when it was made. It's really difficult for a great deal of people to wrap their minds around different eras that projected different obstacles because of lack of communication. There's no doubt in the past 50 years, communication has just exploded pertaining to satellite, internet, and stuff that we take advantage of that we did not have back then. I'm going to say probably now in today's society in the year 2022 that there's probably almost 90% of all communications is done through satellite. And if it's done through satellite, it's done through the internet. There's still a little bit of towers out there that project power and pull off local news stations. But I'm talking about overall here in America today, 90% of our communications, 90% of our media works off of satellite infrastructure. The very infrastructure that did not exist 50, 60 years ago like it does today. There may have been a satellite or two up there that maybe the Army or the Navy or whoever was using. But as far as being at the hand's distance of communicating with somebody on the other side of the world, that didn't exist back then. You couldn't have just randomly answered the phone or called somebody driving down the road. A matter of fact, most people that had old-timey communication lines either was picking up on TV networks to the point that you had either the rabbit ears or you had to turn the TV station, the antenna, in a certain direction to be able to pick up that signal, or people just had basic standard landlines. And of course, if you go back 150 years before then, what started all this communication? How did we even attempt to go over to the world that we're in right now? It was basically whenever they whenever they communicated towards tap 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 tap, as far as Morse code, with various lines that was strung up in various places, to where you could communicate that way. We have went to the extreme hard far right whenever it comes to communications in today's society in comparison to what it was like 150, 200 years ago. So whenever somebody like this, okay, brings up all this other stuff about all these other different colonialism countries and stuff, I understand what he's saying. But you got to understand, towards understanding the methods and the times that those people was living in during the time that they was living in them. Because life was completely, totally different back then in comparison to what it is today. Are we living today in a better facet because of our inventions, because of the satellites, because of the internet? That in and of itself is debatable. Because you can be given too much information. That was one of the reasons why that various governments kept various secrets from their citizens, is because they wasn't sure of how that they was going to respond or react after that they was exposed to this type of information or this type of knowledge. So rather than start a big hullabaloo, rather than start a panic, rather than start a big conspiracy thing, they basically kept it out of sight, out of mind. Yeah, the governments knowed what each other knew, and they knowed what each other was thinking. But as far as their citizens, they was kept in the dark. And the reason why that they was kept in the dark was because of confusion, was because of panic. Today, we are being bombarded with too much information. Today, that example is starting to live out to its fullest extent towards people not knowing how to accept so much information. I still truly believe that January the 6th, that happened now going on 2 years ago, would not have transpired the way that it did if there wasn't internet, social media platforms, and communications. They would not have festered up that type of bitterness, hatefulness, resistance, whatever word you want to use, against their government here in America, if they was blindsided to the degree that they didn't know the things that they thought that they knew. And that leads into another issue towards people being lied to and people being deliberately misled, entrapped, whatever word you want to use, by various people that want to take advantage of their position, such as Donald J. Trump. He took advantage of that position. He had the big mic, and he knew that he had the big mic, and he thought that if he could keep repeating the same lie again and again and again, that eventually people would start believing it. Well, to some degree, that was true. People started believing Donald J. Trump's lie about how that the election had been stolen. That should put you in the proper perspective towards satellite, TV, internet, social media platform of how powerful it is today versus how that it didn't exist 50, 60, 75, 100, 200, 300 years ago. See the differences? Pretty big difference, isn't it? Pretty big difference.
Joining me now to dig deeper into this discussion on colonialism is Melissa Murray, professor of law at NYU and co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast, and Dr. Kayandi Andrews. Not only is he a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, but he was the first ever professor of Black Studies in the United Kingdom. He's also the author of the book, The New Rage of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. Good morning to both of you. Thank you for being with us. Professor Andrews, let me start with you, because it's not that that people don't think that there's a space for this discussion, but there are a lot of people on my Twitter timeline right now saying today's not the day for this discussion. Your thoughts?
Well, it's not a coincidence. I think this is an American channel. I mean, in the UK, it very much is a case of respect the Queen. We should all be very sad. We should all be mourning. But as you rightly point out, there are many people in this country, millions of people in this country, who have a very different relationship to the Queen because of the role of empire, because, I mean, she symbolizes a lot of the racism we've faced. So for a lot of those, we're not mourning today.
Melissa, I don't mean to be unfair. I actually like the Queen. I think she was a great leader, and I credit her for being there at the end of the British Empire and seeing it to its proper death. But there are mixed feelings. There are a lot of people who benefited from the British Empire, and a lot of people like me who were born in countries that were former colonies that to this day do not thrive, and some of its people do not thrive because of the history of colonialism, not just British, but colonialism in general.
I think that's exactly right, Ali. And I think one of the things that's been missing from the dialogue around the world and on social media is that there are actually people who do have respect, reverence, even affection for the Queen. And many of them, or many of us, are struggling to reconcile those very warm feelings with our very real objections to the legacy of colonialism in these countries, with which we have very strong ties, and the legacy of post-colonialism in those places. And I think you can do two things at once. I think you have to do two things at once, and we have to both reckon with the mourning of this revered leader, but also with the legacy of the institution that she represents.
So, Professor Andrews, you teach this, in fact, to your students. How do you express colonialism? What's the short form of the effect of colonialism today? Was it bad? I draw the conclusion that yes, it was bad. It was exploitative. It was violent, and it was economic exploitation of people. Do you share the view? Is it bad?
Of course, colonialism was bad. It was terrible. And if you just look at a map of the world by GDP per capita, the poorest countries today are in so-called sub-Saharan Africa, where the black people live, and the richest countries are the West, where white people live. We literally have a world which is in the image of white supremacy, which came from this colonial era. And the royal family, unfortunately, and the Queen in particular, symbolized that system. That's one of the reasons she's so popular, is because she is a throwback to those colonial times when Britain was great and when Britain dominated the world. And you cannot separate that history from the poverty that we see around the world today. Like, my family is predominantly Jamaican. Jamaica, there shouldn't be any black people in Jamaica. It's all slavery, and it's a very poor country. So these things aren't things which happened in the past. They're things that are very much with us today.
Melissa, tell me about you, how you look at this, because I've seen that you've been on conversations in social media about this with people who are from diasporas that were colonized by the British. Tell me about the complexity of your thought on this.
Well, like Professor Andrews, I am also a descendant of Jamaicans. My parents are Jamaican immigrants, and although I was raised predominantly in the United States, I spent a lot of time in Jamaica during my childhood. I went to school in Kingston at one point, and I think it's hard to reconcile the way in which you literally live with the vestiges of a colonial past when you're living in a country like that. The streets are named for monarchs and aristocrats, and the infrastructure is very much something that is imposed by the British government, was placed there by the British government. And as Professor Andrews says, a lot of it hasn't been updated. The country is desperately poor in a lot of places, and it's hard to reconcile your affection for the Queen and what she stands for without also grappling with what it means for the material conditions of your family and those that you love who continue to live in these places that were touched by the British Empire.
And plus, you need to also look at how that, though they have different names called oligarchs or imperialism over in China, that you can dress it up any way you want to dress it up towards these superpower people, super powerful, rich, powerful people, which is basically the one percenters, being the one percenters. But it all falls back into unfairness. It all falls back to basically the rich dominating the poor, the has-is versus the has-nots. And of course, even Jesus said, whenever they wanted to chastise him over the woman that was putting ointment on him, that was considered to be very, very wealthy and rich at the time, that the disciples spoke up and said, well, she's wasting this. This could be sold and the money given out to the poor. And Jesus' reflection was this: the poor you have always. Me you do not have always. And that's whenever they made an exception towards saying, we see what you're talking about now. Sure, go ahead and pour this precious ointment on the Lord, even though it could have been sold to help to feed the poor. I think it was the Kennedys that said that you can please part of the people all the time, but you'll never please all the people all the time. Somehow or another, the world is going to have to come together because of all this modern day technology and because of the communications that we have now today that they didn't have 150 years ago. Somehow we're going to have to come together in understanding that there has to be a form of balance between your Democrat, Republican countries to be able to give or take towards the powerful and the rich, being willing to comfort or even share a great deal of their wealth in the degree towards putting the world back in order, towards making it a fair society for all of us, and not just part of all of us. Because I guarantee you, if America right now was to go completely belly up, and they announced in the morning that all the major financial institutions has went poor, and that they was retaliating against their debts, and that they was filing for bankruptcy, there would still be a certain amount of people in that fall that would come out smelling like roses. They would come out on top. That tells you, or it tells me, how unfair that the system has played itself off on towards the 1%ers versus the 99. There's such of a big gap there. I mean, we want to point our fingers and say, well, what about all these major conglomerates pertaining to business people? And I'm just going to throw Donald J. Trump out there as an example, towards them not having to pay taxes, and why everybody else does. Well, that should be a pretty clear reminder towards how unfair that the system had set itself up towards, as far as it being rigged. Whenever you get to looking at the system being broken or the system being rigged, it's not just in our courts. It's not just with our lawmakers. It's across the board towards how these conglomerates, these mighty, mighty, wealthy, rich people, and you can categorize them any way you want to. Colonialism, communism, oligarchs, whoever over in China, you can categorize them any way you want to, but the bottom line is this: it is the rich and the powerful that dominates the weak and the poor. It was that way even going back into the Egyptian days. And that's the reason why that in and during the Egyptian days, the days of Moses, that God instructed Moses to go and tell the pharaohs that what they are doing is wrong. Is wrong. Not almost wrong, not could be wrong, not might be wrong, but wrong. And since then, there has been a struggle. You can call it whatever you want to call it, colonialism, whatever. But I mean, even to this day, you still have drug lords in Mexico and down towards Honduras and in South America, and right here in the United States and other parts of the world too as well. I mean, it's just more obvious down that way, Colombia and places, to where the people that's got the bigger pocketbooks, the people that's got the bigger bank accounts are the people that's basically in charge. And if you don't bow down to their will and their way, you suffer the consequences. Doesn't matter if it's a drug lord, doesn't matter if it's colonialism, doesn't matter if it's oligarchs, doesn't matter if it's crooked politicians right here in America or up in Canada. That's the part that's unfair, and that's the part we're going to have to change as a society to be able to break that stumbling block that obviously a great deal of the powerful and the rich and the corrupt and the unfair people are going to have to wake up to towards just exactly what they are doing to their own country, what they're doing to their own selves. And, you know, one of the leading examples of that is your petroleum oil tycoons. I really and truly do not believe that we would be where we are right now if it wasn't for a great deal of oil tycoons that every time somebody mentioned global warming, oh, that ain't real. Oh, that ain't true. You know, they kept that up now for years and years and years towards trying to convince people that what that they were saying about our environment changing wasn't so. Well, there comes a time, and we're in that time now, that you can no longer debate that out of greed or selfishness. And now they're having to take a back seat to it, and now all of a sudden a great deal of these oil tycoons are now getting involved with the energy market or colliding together towards now they're promoting all these ideals about solar and energy and fossil fuel and battery power cars and all the above. We see what they're doing. They're crawfishing. Once more, they're the very ones that got us in this shape. And if anything, the oil tycoons should be one of the first ones to put out bigger electrical energy grids to be able to put us back on track where we ought to be. Because if we're thinking that the little mama papa businesses are going to pop up everywhere and all of a sudden that's going to be the solution to the problem, it ain't going to happen that way. It's going to have to take a major influx of people, interest, investment to be able to turn this around. Because we right now are on a course of doom and gloom whenever it comes to us seeing the devastation that we're seeing happening all over the world pertaining to natural catastrophes that are only going to get worse, either in the form of floods or fires or all the above. It's only going to get worse. And of course, I, being a spiritual man, being a spiritual leader, reflect more so towards a spiritual movement pertaining to a true revival that will lead into a revolution like this, because you can preach all you want to preach to the choir, and some of them are going to listen and some of them are not, just like all these oligarchs that's already stiffened their pockets with all this greed, and they own God only knows what. I mean, there's yachts out there that's almost worth a freaking $1 billion. I couldn't believe that whenever I heard that. A freaking yacht that basically takes a whole army of people to run that is worth that type of money. It's basically a walking, talking city, a town that's on water. And if you go over into China, they are the world's worst right now, because China produces like a millionaire a day. Or they had been up until COVID. I don't know what they're doing now. But if you look at how some of them conglomerates over there are imperialism people over there are living compared to their citizens, oh my God. It's one of the most shamefulest, disgracefulest thing that I think that you could ever think of. Some of them people actually own cities on the water. They don't just own the island. They own the surrounding waterways around the island that they're building floating cities on. Taking all that money and using it for sinful, wicked, pleasurely things. And forgetting about the poor. Forgetting about the unfortunate ones that have slipped it through the cracks. And we're seeing this more and more today, not only in China, not only in Russia, not only with the drug lords, but we're seeing it right here in America, to where your major institutions has come in to dominate society. And I'm just going to throw this out there for an example. Your insurance companies, Allstate, State Farm, Farm Bureau, Progressive, Geico. I could go down a long list, probably use 100 different names of the bigger ones, starting out with the biggest: Farmers, Farm Bureau, all the above. But these people have created their own institutions off of the backs of false, fake narratives, in promising their customer base that they're going to be there in case something happens. But yet now, whenever something does happen, what do? They crawfish. They rebel on their word. They basically turn what they're involved in into an extortion. You can call it legalized extortion if you want to, but I don't see none of them going to jail. Just like what happened during Katrina and other storm-related events, to where it's just so overwhelming with the local insurance companies, they immediately start crying, help, help, help. And that's whenever their local governor or their local whatever requires for federal help. Well, whenever they require for federal help, what does that put? Where does the burden fall upon? It falls upon the burden of the government. Who is the government? We, the people. It falls upon, and in the meantime, we're sitting here watching these people lie to these people. We're sitting here watching these people continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and they continue to keep knocking people down, or they continue to keep choking. I'm going to use the industry that I was involved in the auto body industry, because the body shop wanted to charge 4 hours for a dent, and some estimator working for the insurance company says, well, that ain't but an hour dent versus a 4 hour dent. We're only going to pay an hour versus 4 hours. And I'm just using that for a quick example towards how that these rich, powerful, like I said, you can call them colonialisms, like you can call them oligarchs, you can call them drug lords, you can call them conglomerates. They come in and they stifle and they hurt and they destroy people's lives just in the name of their own personal commonwealth. And that is wrong. It has always been wrong. It will continue to be wrong. And that was the reason why that God intervened with Moses towards telling the Egyptians that what that they was involved in was in fact wrong. And we're doing the very exact same thing today. We're just dressing it up a little different, or we're calling it different names in different positions or in different countries. And like I said, the oil, petroleum, product communities are the very ones that has helped put us where we are right now. It's kind of like the tobacco industry. Whenever they was telling everybody that tobacco might cause problems with your health, knowing all along that it would. Knowing all along that it would. Why did they do that? They done that in the name of self-preservation pertaining to greed. And it wasn't until, I guess, what, the 80s, maybe the 90s, is whenever government finally, your lobbyists finally got in behind this and recognized that these people are just basically monsters. I mean, I'm going to say this, and I don't mean to hurt nobody's feelings about it, but I could go right now in less than 25, 30 miles from where I live right now in Northwest Tennessee. And I could go up towards the Kentucky range and probably even in places up in Henry County, especially up towards middle Tennessee, but more so up in Kentucky, right here close at hand. And you will find some of the most marvelous, greatest people in the world that go to church, that are church oriented, that believe in keeping all the commandments of God. And on Sunday, everybody is dressed appropriately in church. All the women sit on one side, all the men sit on the other. Whenever it comes to their politeness, whenever it comes to their gratification, whenever it comes to their way of life, you probably couldn't ask for a better bunch of people. And the people that I'm talking about is basically your Mennonites. I don't know that much about Amish. I think that the Amish has proven themselves to be more dirtier than they have clean. But even the Mennonites that claim to be decent, good people are most of the time the very people that are running, growing, producing, and harvesting the tobacco industry crops just 30, 40 miles from here. Most of the time, you will find those are the people that have invested in these type of investments, even though even now in the 21st century knows the products that they're growing is chemically bad to people's health. And it's not so much the tobacco that's killing people, it's the chemicals that they're spraying on the tobacco. Because to grow a true tobacco field and do it going back before the chemical era come into play, it required a great deal of work. Oh my God, it was just endless work towards going in and pulling out the suckers and going in and having to do this and going in and do that. I mean, it was a lot of hard, strenuous work. Well, today they don't have to do that. They like all these other farmers. They just spray it with a certain particular chemical and walk away from it. And now the chemical does that in which what the people was doing. Well, it's the chemicals on the tobacco that has actually caused the tobacco to be more lethal. These are good, sound Christian people that's doing this. So once more, are they not part of the problem in that in which what they're involved in? Because they're creating this stumbling block for more people to become addicted to tobacco and more people to die from the complications of tobacco, especially now today, since they do spray so many chemicals on their tobacco farms. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was a country, and if I'm not mistaken, it was China, that refused to even take any of our soybeans because they understood and realized that the chemicals that we were spraying on the soybeans was the very things that was probably giving people, 4 out of 6 now, cancer. There's a lot. Cancer is taking out about half of the population right now. I realize that they don't talk about cancer like they used to because they got chemotherapy and they got radiation. They got all these other different methods about cancer. But cancer-causing agencies are the very thing that are destroying human beings' lives today, more so than drunken drivers, more so than suicides, more so than drug overdoses, more so than COVID or any other known disease out there. Cancer is the #1 killer to this day and probably will be for the next 20 plus years. And it's only by the hand of God that if God is taking care of you closely enough to the degree that he has you here for a purpose and he don't want you to get cancer, it's only by basically a supernatural entity that causes people not to get cancer, because it's so prone of people getting it today. Because almost everything that we drink, everything that we pick up, everything that we eat, everything that we put in our mouths has some sort of chemical-based relationships to it in some form or fashion. And, you know, it's really intensely sad that greed and the power of greed is what has dominated a great deal of these entities, that has put us into a very, very sick society. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. Before COVID hit, we was already a very, very sick society. We just wasn't looking at it at the time. It was kind of like, well, it wasn't so much out of sight, but it was like out of mind. We're really not going to talk about these things no more because we know it exists, but we're just not going to try to have a solution to the problem. You know why? Because we knew what the problem was. We knew what was causing these cancer-causing agencies. Just like the tobacco industry knew that it was harmful to their health even before World War I. Just like the planet knew. Okay? They knew. Going back 100 years ago, pertaining to the oil industry market, the petroleum market, that what that they was doing was going to cause severe consequences eventually, pertaining to all the automobiles, the trucks, the trains, and everything else that was being operated off of petroleum, crude oil, or gas, or diesel, was going to cause a severe problem. They knew it, but they had convinced us not to talk about it, not to look at it, not to debate it, not to discuss it. And we went for that. Even after it costed a Democratic president, a Democratic presidency pertaining to Al Gore, they was still avoiding and not looking at the consequences up until just within the past 5 years. Within the past 5 years, because so much horrendous things has been occurring, and they should have really looked at it way before now, in understanding that there is no question or doubt in debating this theory anymore that what we are doing to the planet is detrimental. But we didn't until now. And now suddenly we're going to have to awaken and backtrack our tracks and go back and try to make up for lost time. And if we don't do this in an appropriate type fashion, that in and of itself can be detrimental. There's going to have to be a balance towards, just as the interviewers was talking about earlier before I started this program, there's going to have to be a balance pertaining to how that we transition from a oil, petroleum dependency over to other type of energy sources, regardless whether it's wind, battery, or power, or solar, or whatever. People is going to have to use a great deal of imagination. They're going to have to put themselves out there towards making investments. And the people that I think that should be the very people that should be leading the way, it shouldn't be TVA or some of these other big electrical energy sources here in America, but it should be Shell. It should be Chevron. It should be Exxon. It should be the oil producing industry companies that should be making these investments towards supporting and helping in these next challenges that we have to make in the next few years. If not, we're going to be doomed. That's how urgent that this message should be. It's not necessarily about colonialism. It's really not necessarily about oligarchism. It's really not necessarily about all these other big, rich, powerful people, the one percenters. But it's about sharing our ideals and being willing to make commitments for the good of the betterment for all and not just part of all. Now let's go back and let's listen to what he has to say about colonialism, because it is very fascinating in how that people now are observing this. I'm so sorry for the beeping. I'm in the process right now of filming, and I can't knock off my filming and go to this and keep it going on the same format. That's basically my diabetes telephone going off right now, telling me to check my diabetes, and hopefully it'll cut itself off where you ain't got to listen to that beeping sound. Sorry about that.
So, Kayende, how do you reconcile that? Because I think what Professor Murray is bringing up is that it is difficult. It is difficult to hold these two thoughts, but we can hold these two thoughts. You can like the Queen, you can honor the fact that someone has passed, but you can say that she didn't forsake the institution that was responsible for colonialism. She didn't forsake her ancestry that was responsible for that sort of thing. And maybe this is, in fact, the exact moment to have that conversation, because it sits in the background of people's minds. You teach it, you write about it, you think about it a lot, but a lot of people don't.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the question is, do you have affection? And I don't have any affection for the Queen, and that's nothing personal against her. I don't know her. None of us know her, right? And it's sad that someone's passed away. But that affection doesn't exist for many of us. Like my grandmother's generation, they grew up in colonial Jamaica. She was taught to revere the Queen. She had a picture of the Queen on the wall till she died. But we grew up very different. We understood what the Queen was. A realist in the monarchy representing the racism that my generation faced. So there's no conflict. we never have seen as a queen as someone who represents us, as someone who should represent us, and she's died, and it's sad, but there is literally no conflict. We can see the critical nature that has to be brought here. This is somebody who represented white supremacy and colonialism, and as you said, didn't give reparations, didn't give up her wealth, didn't give up her power. She reveled in it. And I'm not sure why I should be sad today. And millions of us in this country have exactly the same feelings as me, I would say.
Professor Murray, I had a discussion, probably more of an argument, about an hour ago with somebody who, with whom I was having this discussion, and he said, "Well, where were you born?" And I said, "I was born in Kenya." And he said, "Well, that country is one of 15 former colonial nations that have chosen the British monarch as their own monarch," as if to say, well, if you did that, then all of colonialism is forgiven and forgotten. But this is a case amongst people from post-colonial countries. Many of them do still keep the British monarchy as their monarch and have continued to be a member of the Commonwealth of Nations.
Jamaica is a member of what the Commonwealth.
Even here in the Continental, we still have 4 states that rules under the pretense of Commonwealth. That if you get to looking at the fundamental favor, even though we had won our independence during the Revolutionary War, there was still people here in America that wanted to maintain that Commonwealth status, which leads to the powerful and the greedy and the selfish taking care of the greedy and the powerful and the selfish. That is the barrier that we're going to have to break. And it's not just the name colonialism. It's basically across the board of the 1%ers versus the 99%ers, of the hases versus the has-nots, pertaining to the rich and the powerful dominating the weak and the poor. That is the bottom line. We have seen over in Europe, over in that area, a gulf of differences between their lifestyles that at one time used to have the same dreams, the same desires, the same motivations towards the middle class being able to work, become loyal, and be rewarded for their works at the end of their lifespan. That has faded completely away over in Europe, in those colonial countries over there, to where now you either have the richest of the rich, or you got the poor. The mid class, the working class, hardly even exist. You wonder how come so many people don't want to work? They don't want to abide by that theory or by that dream or that senseless ideal. It's because they've awoken towards how bad that the system is actually unfair. And they rather be poor. They rather live under a bridge than to struggle and be a slave to society and get 40% or maybe more of everything that they've earned taken out of their check. And they claim that by the time you get through paying your interest, your insurance, your taxes going in, your taxes going out, that if you make $50,000 a year, in reality, you have given over 25 of it away for whatever nonsensical reasons. You know, you may say, well, it ain't nonsense to have insurance. Well, it is whenever you have insurance and they don't produce what they promise you to produce. Whenever you got people that's had screwed up, messed up lives because of senseless ideals towards saying, well, you didn't have flood insurance versus a 200-mile-an-hour wind that created the wall of water that caused a flood. Whenever you have crooked people that are smart in the sense of corruption, that are willing to do their customer base the way that they're doing their customer base right now. And I'm not saying that all insurances is like this, but a great deal of them are. They will try to squander. They will try to retract. They will try to backpedal on every commitment that they have ever made, even though you was a loyal customer to them.
Of what the Commonwealth of Nations.
And that's supposed to be fair? No. What that is called, that's called crooked. That ain't fair. That's called dishonesty. That's called being a crook is what that's called. And whenever you have the governments that supports these institutions, now you have corrupt governments. You have a broken system. You have the 1%ers that takes care of the 1%ers, but don't in reality give a damn about the mid class or the working class. You know, they take care of the poor class because they have to take care of the poor class. If they don't take care of the poor class, then they're sure enough going to be demonized. So, yeah, we'll feed them a bone or two. Oh, yeah, we'll give them a homeless shelter. Oh, yeah, we'll provide this for them and that for them, you know, healthcare services. But in reality, the only reason why the rich take care of the poor is because it's going to make the rich look so bad. They don't give a damn about the poor. They don't give a damn about us. Just like what that guy was talking about a while ago as far as people caring about the Queen. I cared about the Queen because the Queen was a decent person. I cared about the Queen because the Queen had been influential throughout all these years. I cared about the Queen even if she wasn't the Queen, just the mere pure fact that it was another human being that died. Even if she wasn't the Queen, I would care about that. And if any good moral Christian is a good Christian, they should have the same feelings about life as I do. Or I feel like that they should. And if they don't, maybe they should evaluate themselves towards reading the Bible and understanding just exactly what the concept of the teachings of Christ was all about to begin with.
And is one of those Commonwealth realms that you've mentioned. And again, I don't know that simply being part of the Commonwealth means that you cannot interrogate the meaning of colonialism, the legacy of post-colonialism, and what you want to do for your nation going forward into the future. This is a moment of transition for the British monarchy, for the royal family. They're moving on to a new leader. And I think it stands to reason that around the world, there may be countries who are wondering whether continuing to be a part of a monarchy is something that they should do for themselves and for their countrymen.
it was Ted Kennedy, the only really one of the Kennedys that went along with the rich and the powerful, and that's the reason why that they didn't wind up getting him too as well. But it was Ted Kennedy that spoke references about what? Camelot. Camelot. That come before colonialism. Camelot was basically the ingredients for colonialism, because it was usually a rich ruler or a powerful ruler that had a lot of friends that dominated everybody else's life, and 9 times out of 10 it was in a very, very cruel, crude, unfair, mean-spirited way. That goes all the way back to your original kings and how that they had wars, and your Vikings and your Christian colonies and Rome and Catholicism and you know, I mean, I could go on and on and on about this, but I'm pretty sure those that are listening that care anything about our future of breaking this barrier would agree with the things that are being discussed here today on this particular program. Yes, long live the king, which basically means may God bless the king. Now there's no longer a queen. I used to say all the time, long live the queen, long live the queen, which basically means the same thing. May God bless the queen. May God bless the queen in her long longevity in how that she conducts herself in all fairness pertaining to her people. I think it was on Starship, on the Star Trek Enterprise, that Spock always projected his two hands, his 2 different fingers separating, that basically represented long life and prosperity. Sorry about the beeping. I must have gone over into the red. I'm going to have to hurry up and take this off.
Colonialism in that fashion is behind us, because there are still exploited countries. There are still exploited people. It's no longer necessarily a white people versus people of color thing, or European countries. How do you think about colonialism moving forward, as opposed to looking at it from a rearview mirror?
Well, no, I mean, all that's happened is colonialism has changed, right? So it isn't European nation state dominated. Since the Second World War, there's been a very clear shift where America's now the center. Countries have their freedom in theory, but then places like Jamaica still have the royal family as head of state. But actually, if you look at the economics of it, it's exactly the same. As I said earlier, the poorest countries in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. The richest are in the West. You can see those massive imbalances of wealth, which are causing migration crises. And actually, the basic logic of Western imperialism was that black and brown life is disposable in order so that white life can be enriched. And if you're honest and you look at the world today, that hasn't changed in any meaningful way at all. And the reason why I think so many of us don't see the royal family as a symbol and the Queen as someone to look up to is because actually why that family is popular and why the Queen was so popular is because she kind of represented imperialism in a cuddly way that we all felt warm about in some ways. And that's probably one of the worst things that can happen, right? If we're celebrating something, the royal family in this case, which can only be bad and just needs to be abolished.
I appreciate it. This is a difficult conversation to have. It's probably not difficult for you, but it's a difficult moment in which to have this conversation.
I think personally that since going back into the conversation I had a while ago pertaining to all the transparency, it's kind of like the same thing that America's dealing with right now, with everybody having cell phones and so much technology being out there, that now these cruel, indifferent law enforcement agencies that was protecting their people and doing this type of harm and hurt to society, that now they're being exposed. And the reason why they're being exposed is because of the smartphone technology, the internet. They're being exposed. Well, colonialism has been being exposed, especially since World War II, during the time that Queen Elizabeth held her reigns. And I think she knew that. And because she knew that, she was being more indifferent or tolerable or compromising in colonialism type ways versus how that her prior ancestors run things in a colonial type way. There's no doubt that we're dealing today with the same type of barbaricness citizenship on an individual level towards people not being able to govern their lives. They don't want to tell the truth. They're very greedy. They're very selfish. And if we didn't have guardrails in how that we was going to, per se, rule the people, it would become an unimaginable society to live in. It would basically become the same type of society that it was before the Great Flood, and God would have to destroy the society because it was so out of tune or out of balance towards the unfairness of everything that was going on. And that was one of the primary reasons why that God done what he done. It's not that God is a mean, cruel God, because he's not a mean, cruel God. He's very, very passionate about the creation that he created, especially the human creation. But he does intend for us to respond and react and correspond in a certain way. And whenever we no longer do that, then it causes all these complications and all these consequences. And in the consequences, rather than the suffering continue to suffer, that's whenever God puts an end to it. That's how I see what happened during the Great Flood, is that it gotten out of hand to the point that there was no way of realigning society, especially with 99.9% of them being as cruel and as wicked as what they was, heathenistic, barbaric. They didn't care about the young. They didn't care about the elderly. They didn't care about the weak. They didn't care about anybody else other than caring about themselves. And that's why God destroyed that world. And that will be basically the same reason why he does what he's going to do to this world if we continue on the path that we're on towards not opening up our eyes and listening to other people, even such as myself, towards discussing the things that are right and wrong and fair and not fair.
I stand with those who think this is the right moment to have this conversation. Melissa Murray is a professor at the New York University School of Law and the co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast. Dr. Kayandi Andrews is a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University and the author of The New Age of Empire. NBC's Chris Jansing is back with me from London. Chris, you've been in London since yesterday. You have seen the crowds outside of Buckingham Palace, the dozens of people, the tens of thousands of people who have been coming by to pay their respects to Queen Elizabeth II. Give me a sense of the mood there.
Yeah, I think it's mixed, because I think there's a somberness about the loss of a queen, and there's a disquieting feeling for change. We all feel that, like, when there's change. But I was thinking, Ali, as you were saying, how this queen brought us into the digital age, how things have really changed. And of course, has not always been for the better. We spend a lot of time looking at our phones. We text instead of talking, and there seem to be fewer and fewer things that bring us together. And yet, as I look over my shoulder and I see the crowds that continue to pour in by the thousands, it is something that brings people together. It's been a long time. It feels like for a lot of folks, because of the pandemic, that they've been able to be together. And there is a sense of comfort that comes at a time of change. Whatever you may have thought or felt about the Queen, and perhaps more to the point, if you feel something different about the man who is now King Charles, there is something about coming together and being together and witnessing a moment in history and sharing that in close proximity with other people. I think that does bring to the folks who have come here, and in the conversations I've had with them, a sense of belonging, a sense that you can still come together in a world that often seems very disconnected. And the other thing I would say very briefly is that it does have a feeling of a peaceful transition of power, a different kind of power, obviously, than we talk about in the United States, but one that seems to have been so seriously frayed back home where you are, Ali.
I think one of the conversations we had earlier...
I'm going to stop right there, because our system over here has been frayed. People's opinions has been frayed. I think that a lot of people has awakened. in recognizing how that our government here in America has steered us down the wrong paths. And even to this day, there's still not full accountability towards where we are, where we shouldn't be. And I feel like that there's still a lot of unanswered questions pertaining to accountability issues pertaining to 9/11, which is coming up tomorrow in its 21st anniversary. You know, there's a lot of suffering going on right now here in America. There's a lot of people that's going to have to make, that are making, and is going to have to make a lot of sacrificial type sacrifices on whether or not they're going to buy their medicine this winter, or they're going to have adequate heat, or they're going to be able to put tires on their automobile, or they're going to be able to take that trip to be able to go visit that loved one that they care about. There is a lot of uncertainties over here in America right now that has reluctantly put us in this position, and that's the reason why I believe that January the 6th, going on 2 years ago now, has occurred, is that people are awakening and they demand responsibility and accountability. They demand answers. And the way that we get answers is by just doing like I've been doing, by stopping, talking, sharing my opinions, putting in my input, just like the commentators here, towards them saying what they're saying. This is their side of how that they have analyzed and perspective things. You know, this is their perspective of how that they have viewed what they have viewed and what they're understanding. And there's nothing wrong with that. And we should discuss that with the oligarchs and also with the colonialisms and even the drug lords, if you can. I mean, those people, I don't even know that they're conscious enough to be able to conduct a conversation like this. But there has to be some sort of middle ground between the 1%ers and the 99%ers if we are going to go forward in combating our problems together and living out a dream or a desire that at one time used to be in focus that now no longer is. Why is that no longer in focus? That's the $64,000 question. Thank you again for listening. Good luck for each and every one of us as we continue this quainting moment of the loss of mourning Saint Elizabeth II in her despairing moments of death, but also recognizing her achievements in a 70-year rule. God bless America. God bless our American troops, and good luck to each and every one of us, and shalom.